Good morning. Bon dia. Can you hear me? Okay. It's lovely to be here. I'm just waiting for the thing that turns the slides over. It's a fantastic building. It's incredible. It looks beautiful from up here. It's really lovely. And thank you also for inviting me here as well. I came to Viana last year just as part of a vacation when I was working in Portugal. And I was sitting by the river, eating some local fish, drinking some local wine, absolutely slowing down almost to a full stop, and it was a really nice afternoon spent here. And I really commend the whole vision and the approach that's been undertaken through this program, and I think strategically by the city as a whole, and the questions that you're asking about how you can slow down, how you can develop a sustainable economy, how you can integrate creativity through your strategic approach to city making. These are really important questions, I think, for cities like this, for smaller cities, but also I think that for bigger cities as well across the world. I think it's not just about the crash, it's not just about the speed that digital technology is introduced to our lives, it's also about how we develop meaningful and distinctive relationships, about well-being and about confidence. And I think all of these things are wrapped up in the agenda, in the Cittaslow movement, but also I think just in terms of the strategic agendas that cities are taking here and elsewhere. I often feel potentially a little bit of a hypocrite or an outsider when I'm talking in conferences that are all about place, about slowness, about distinctiveness, because on a personal level, in what I do, is I work all over the world, talking to cities, to governments, to institutions, about their own individual plans, about their own strategic agendas. But to do that means I have to travel very quickly across different time zones in often a quite a frantic, unhealthy way. So I might be talking about slowness and distinctiveness, but actually on a personal level, that's not something that I actually genuinely get to appreciate, certainly not enough. But certainly, having said that, it makes it all the more important that we do develop local places that have that kind of really rich, nuanced, individual feeling. Because otherwise, when we do stop, when we do slow down, what have we got? We don't want to be somewhere that's generic, that's placeless, that's homogenized. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is actually working with smaller cities like this, but also, of course, because everywhere is different, cities very different to here, to explore the role of creativity in those cities in terms of how they can develop sustainable economies, how they can improve the well-being of citizens, how they can combine agendas, whether it's around community, around economy, around innovation, education. So recently, last year, I was really privileged to be working not so far away from here in Guimarães as part of European Capital of Culture, where I was programming the Creative City. Now it's going by itself. The Creative City. It's a very old building. There are probably all sorts of spirits in the theatre. And maybe it's because I'm talking about another city in Viana. But the Creative City program was about how you engage with localness and distinctive identities, deep histories in a contemporary way, and how you position creativity as a resource, not just for economic development, but also for social development, for finding a role, finding a progressive role for a city in a global environment. And the big question we were asking was to reimagine the possibility of the city. And I think that's what you're also trying to do here. What is possible here? What does success look like? What does growth mean here? What does speed mean in this environment? Currently, we're working with Madeira as well, asking about the role of creativity there and what the creative economy might look like in a small island in the middle of the ocean. Now, there are some common questions, but also some very specific things that you always need to explore in that environment. And also, I think there are some common questions when it comes to how you build things like scale and connectiveness in small places. Later on, you'll be hearing about business development, markets. So much of the economy, or the traditional models around economic development, are about building scale and getting there quickly. They're about critical mass. They're about agglomeration. They're about deep talent pools. They're about connection. All of those kinds of language, all that kind of language is very kind of big business. It's very metropolitan. But in a smaller place, when we build visions for smaller places, when we build strategy for smaller places, we actually need to critically analyze what those kind of phrases mean. And also, of course, we have to do this quickly. Although we're talking about slowness, we need to get to grips with what is driving the economy, what is possible here in a global context because of the crisis and because of the challenges that's provided to us, the urgency of the moment provided by that. What I'm going to do today is to provide, I think, a critical analysis of this whole creative economy, creative industries agenda. I'm going to try to position it position it for smaller cities and to ask some specific questions for you, Viana, in terms of how you understand the role of creativity and how you develop your creative economy on your terms in a way that's meaningful for you, in a way that means you can judge what success looks like. You can say whether you've delivered, and you can develop your own distinctive take on the creative economy. Now, there are a few things I just want to clear up at the beginning, really, about what I mean by the creative economy, and also a few things I want to perhaps provide a critical perspective on, because we have got very carried away with ourselves across the world in the last few years, talking about creativity, talking about the importance of creativity or the importance of the creative industries for everywhere. Now, first of all, and I ask you, are we genuinely in a situation where the economy nowadays is driven as much by ideas, is driven as much by intangible acts of creativity as it is by things that you get out of the ground, things that you get out of the ocean? Is it all about recreation? Is it all about modernity? Or is it actually about a continuation, a seamless development from the past? What, I ask you, is the balance between culture and economy? Can we make money out of culture without negating the things that drive us as individuals, as communities, in terms of our cultural identity, our sense of history, our sense of distinctiveness? Can we monetize, can we appropriate cultural acts for business? And can we do that in a way that doesn't enforce a language and a structure and an approach to culture that actually ruins the thing that makes us distinctive, that makes us expressive as individuals and communities? In the last few years, those kinds of questions have been wrapped up in a bigger discussion around the creative industries, developing businesses through culture, businesses through creativity. And there are lots of definitions, and I often use this old one from the UK government, 12 years old now. But what they have at their heart is individual creativity, skill and talent. Now, I'll argue a little bit throughout this presentation that in some ways we've lost that essence about the individual and the distinctive when we talk about the creative industries. And in some ways we've got a situation where too many places are trying to copy one another in terms of developing approaches to supporting and developing the creative industries. And perhaps the reason for that is that they've been driven purely by economic growth agendas, rather than trying to embed creativity across agendas in placemaking, in community, in planning. So they've decided, too many places, to just develop a model for the creative economy, responding to the tantalizing macro headline figures about why the creative industries is important and why the creative economy as a whole is important. Now, there haven't been many mapping studies since the crisis, but before the crisis, There are lots of headline figures about how the creative industries is the fastest growing sector, how it's employing the most people, how it's disproportionately providing value to the economy in terms of the added value that it delivers, how it's something that also appeals to distinctiveness, to the kind of vanity that we have as individuals, but also as places, in terms of the kind of cultural capital that it can deliver for you. So lots of places got intoxicated by the economic value. But at the same time, as part of this agenda, there's an awareness that if you're going to restructure your economy, if you're going to have a more balanced economy, then the creative industries can play an important role in that. Wherever you have talent, wherever you have people, therefore, making things, creating things, you have the potential to develop a creative economy, a creative industries sector. So there's an agenda here, not just about growth, per se, but also about rebalancing the economy. And the creative industry is seen as part of that momentum, part of that agenda about rebalancing the economy. There are different reasons for that. For example, what we see is the nature of work is changing. We see a movement from bigger businesses to a more fragmented, smaller business approach. We see a move from large agglomerations to freelance, to mobile creative businesses, where people gain their scale by coming together as teams. They gain their scale through working collaboratively from different disciplines. We see, on the one hand, an increasingly global economy when it comes to knowledge sectors and creative sectors. And of course, that's enabled by digital technology, where you can seamlessly create teams from across the world. And we see shifts in terms of demand. Now, in some ways, this is related to wealth, related to ability to pay, where even with the crisis, the growth of the global middle class has been unrelenting. And also, though, the growth of people looking for distinctive, personalized goods and experiences that tell stories and tell stories about themselves. And I'll go into this a little bit later, because I think this is where agendas around creativity and slowness absolutely come together. And then finally, and you'll notice that it says 5 things, and there are actually 6 things, because finally, the 6th thing that's always dropped off this list is about place. So people talk about globalness, about speed, about connectivity, and they forget the thing that really drives creativity, the thing that enables the creative industry sector to flourish and grow, is about building relationships in local places. It's about personal contact. It's about leveraging the spirit of distinctiveness. It's about places like this. It's about history and the contemporary coming together. And creative businesses and culture overall is about meaning-laden goods and experiences. And places are the most effective way of understanding meaning and articulating meaning and identity. Some more things that are driving this agenda around creativity. The way our economy has been disrupted overall, particularly, although not exclusively, by digital technology. The whole process of localness, the whole process of identity creation is so different to what it used to be. But we need to be careful here as well, because people get very carried away, particularly when they talk about growth in the creative industries, around the role of technology. And they talk about the digital industries as being the bit where the growth happens, and the rest is all about culture and things like that. But actually, although, of course, we've seen huge growth in the market for digital technology, we haven't actually seen that proportionately yet in terms of growing huge sectors of digital content across the economy. We're still, I think, in the foothills of sector development there. And I like this quote, even it's a long time ago, but in the computer age, you can see the computer age everywhere but the productivity statistics. So people, I think, sometimes get a little bit carried away around how digital technology is providing growth opportunities for everybody. Not necessarily. And I think even though that quote's a long time ago, we need to be careful in terms of how we position the role of technology in terms of driving growth and productivity across the economy. And the reason I say that is that if you look at growth in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the introduction of digital technology, the internet, etc., has not actually replaced the economies that were in Northern Europe, for example. It hasn't replaced the old manufacturing sector. It's smaller than the economies that we were losing. So we mustn't get too carried away with ourselves. Where, though, I think the creative sector can be most exciting is around the convergence agenda, the way that it adds value to other activities, the way that creativity can be the kind of oil, the glue, the mobilizer for different sectors. So we see, for example, how in the fashion sector, traditional fashion practice coming together with new technology around plastics, materials, and we can see how that's driving innovation across that sector. We see the rise of cultural tourism as opposed to mass tourism. And I think that places that have local, energetic production around culture and creativity are most attractive and appealing to those cultural tourists who are looking for individual, distinctive experiences. And I think that absolutely comes together with the whole slow food movement. Because in some ways, and we have to be careful here, in some ways the slow food movement is an interpretation of creativity applied to traditional practice. And in some ways, it's part of the same narrative of the creative industries, where we're looking for the distinctive, the personal, the thing we can tell stories about, the thing that we can tell stories about ourselves, the thing that makes us look different, and in some ways, the thing that makes us feel better about ourselves. And it's no surprise that we see it coming together in terms of the way that design has played an important role in giving credibility to the overall slow food movement. Look at the packaging. Look at the overall sense of a design aesthetic in the slow food movement. I think that's where creativity and the creative industries have come together with the food sector. And we see, I think, overall, where in some ways we're in a position where people lament the way that our cities are all becoming the same, the way that everything feels similar. Wherever you go, there are kind of places you can plug in and feel the same, whether it's about Starbucks or whether it's about the kind of way that hotels and airports all seem so similar. Bus stations, train stations all seem so similar. And actually, if you provide and develop an environment where creative people with distinctive cultural backgrounds can flourish to develop productive economies, making things, creating experiences, then you move away from this sense where there's a dearth of authenticity in our cities, which is replaced by homogenization. You move to a place where our cities and particular neighborhoods can again return to becoming distinctive. And those are the places that are attractive, not just to cultural tourism, but they're also attractive to talent that wants to build a relationship, a meaningful relationship in their neighborhoods. People are in search of the authentic, the distinctive, the personalized, and in some ways the deep. And practicing and engaging with environments where the creative industries are flourishing is a means of enabling that to happen. Some other things that are happening which are important, I think, for understanding the role of the creative economy agenda. One is the leaking economies that we have, not just in terms of the porousness of them, where the value is lost because we're trapped in a global economy, but also in terms of the way what that means for our talent, the way that our talent is so mobile, the way that places have to appeal to and become meaningful for talent, particularly talent that's higher skilled, more global in its mindset, more connected. We need to find ways of providing opportunities for talent, not just to stay, but also to return and to re-return, to build relationships with places so that they can actually feel welcome, feel there's an enabling environment for them to do their business and live their lives. And on a macro level, and this is what the governments in particular are really interested in, is around how creativity plays a role in our overall competitiveness. And this is where we get into dangerous territory, because this is where I think the creative industries gets caught in this agenda around growth and speed. It gets caught in this agenda around how we have to replace those old jobs purely through the creative industries. It's because other economies, the fastest growing economies in the world, from the brick economies and the civets economies, are also talking about the creative industries. They're also developing creative economy strategies and things like that. So I prefer it when we don't just talk about going fast, we don't just talk about speed, and we don't just talk about growth for growth's sake, but we're perhaps more subtle, we're more nuanced, and we look at creativity more generally as a tool, as a resource, something that should be integrated into everything we do, whether it's about governance, whether it's about infrastructure, whether it's about strategies for community, strategies for education. and it's something that perhaps gets lost in this agenda around speed and competitiveness. I think where it gets lost most particularly is in the kind of creative branding exercises that we see in too many places, seen, as I say there, as a weapon in the war for attention, where lots of places are starting to prefix their city with the word creativity, where creative is seen as a necessary adjective for everything that that city does. Now, we need to be careful there in this environment. We need to ensure that when we use the word creativa, that it is meaningful here, and it's not being used in the same way that everyone else is using it. Because then we fall victim to that whole point, that whole issue around homogeneity, which is something that I guess here we're trying to avoid that. So we need to look deeply at what creativity means in Viana. We need to answer some of these questions through this process. What kind of place are you here? What is particularly, distinctively creative about this place? What is it you want to be? Where are you going? What does success look like? What are your KPIs, if you like? And in that environment, what is the role of creativity there? And how do you be holistic in the way that you position creativity as a tool, as a resource, as a mobilizer? And how fast do you go? Or do we just say, it's absolutely not about the speed, it's about the quality, it's about the distinctiveness? And what do we mean by capital here? Because I think where creative industries strategies go wrong is what they talk about capital just in terms of monetary, it's just being a monetary resource, rather than about human capital, rather than about the collective memory that you have, rather than about the social capital that you have in terms of the connections that you as individuals and communities have across the country and across the world. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of a travel story in terms of where I think we need to critically rethink the role of creativity and the creative industries, not just here but everywhere. And I'm going to come down to some specific questions that I have for you about what you're doing here. I'll also introduce some ideas, some good practice from other places that I think are important. And through that process, hopefully we'll cover most of the areas that I think are significant if you're going to develop a sustainable, value-adding, and ultimately successful strategic agenda for creativity in this city. So when we talk about the creative industries after the crisis, we need to talk about it very differently to how we talked about it before the crisis. And before the crisis, we had all these sorts of images, these kinds of graphics, which were all, kind of classic going upwards, growth, 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 and where does growth lead, ultimately? What does that deliver to you? Because can you just be exponential with this? What happens when you continue? What are the resource implications of that? Can you be infinitely creative? Can the creative industries, as some would say, take over and be the dominant sector in certain economies? Probably not, let's face it. What we need to understand is the position of the creative sector as part of a mixed economy. We need to understand how people who are, as part of their core practice, developing, whether it's music or fashion or film or design, we need to understand how they play a critical, but not universally dominant role in our economies. We need to find a narrative for the value that creativity provides to our economy, but also to our place. In the scrap for resources, the fight over a finite amount of public sector and now private sector money, we need to find an appropriate way of contextualizing the role of the creative industries in our localities. And we need to do that differently to how we did it before. A lot of creative strategies were very top-down. They were very government-driven or municipality-driven. Now, of course, the crisis, for right and for wrong, has reduced the faith that people have in the capacity for our governments to deliver. But more than that, I think, the way that creative processes run, the way that we are all now much more active in the way that we create experiences, whether it's through the use of digital technology or the growth of live music, the growth of crowd events, we need to be more collaborative and participatory in the way that we co-create agendas for change. This is not just about strategy and governance. This is about a collective approach to sector development. We need to move away, therefore, from what I call the boosterish approaches to the creative economy and culture-led change. This kind of race that we had before the crash, for places to become the number one attraction for artists and creative people, to fill this place with creatives, as part of a process that was, I guess, crudely about arts or culture-led regeneration. The prize was the kind of creative regeneration and repositioning of cities. Cities seeing themselves as part of a competition with one another. The outcome was, as we see here, a lot of spectacular, almost kind of out-of-this-world cultural infrastructure. But also, the outcome often was a gap between the rhetoric around creativity and the reality of what was happening on the ground with this creative cities agenda. I think, since the crisis, have moved away from a situation where we were seduced by creativity or this notional creative age. We're more reserved, we're more skeptical, and rightly so. My colleague, Charles Ledbetter, in a conference that we held in Guimarães last year, he likened the word creativity to this word, dolphins. And the reason being is that, if you say the word dolphins or think of that kind of language, it brings a smile to your face. It's a nice feeling. It's a pleasant thing, and you can't disagree with dolphins. Just like who could disagree with the word creative? Who could say, well, creativity is a bad thing? Or why would we want to be creative? They're creative. You cannot do that. So there's a little bit of a situation where we've been allured by this language, and we've relaxed too easily into talking about how creative we are without doing the things that are important if you're going to be credibly creative. The glossy rhetoric of the creative age. We need to move beyond that. We should think in terms of, if we're going to be somewhere that in 10 years' time still talks about Viana Criativa, then there needs to be a sustainable underpinning to that whole agenda. And one of the reasons for that is not just because brands come and go and the energy around certain kinds of language comes and goes, but also we're seeing now the actual practical outcomes, the downturn of the creative agenda in certain places that talked about being creative, did the easy things but didn't do the difficult things. So we had a creative property boom, a creative-led property boom, where in some places creativity was seen as a means for accelerating private capital, as a means to regenerate, often just physically regenerate, difficult parts of the city, often post-industrial parts of the city, old dockland areas, difficult bits by the water, the old places where a lot of factories were. This is a brewery, for example, in East London. Artists and creative people were arguably seen as just tools. They were a means to an end. They were like pawns on a chessboard. They were the startup phase in urban production economies. They were a way to get the bigger capital in, part of the attraction process. If you have an artist quarter or a creative cluster, that was seen, yes, on the one hand as part of rebalancing your economy, but the bigger goal was about getting corporate capital into your city. So we saw lots of things happening in the 90s where cities all over the world tried to find ways of attracting and co-locating their artists, their creative businesses in old factories, in rundown parts of the city. In some ways, the artists and the creatives already went there on their own terms, and then the municipality thought, how do we translate this into something that delivers a bigger value to us? Let's engage it, let's embrace it. And we saw that everywhere, trying to attract creative people to certain parts of the city. But the end game, what we saw was that those artists were attracted, but then they were displaced. They were a victim of their own success, some would say, because in turn, the property prices around them went up, the private development companies moved in, and we started to get the kind of city as spectacle, place as fantasy, place as playground. We started to get these strangely distinctive, but also weirdly homogenous areas of our cities, these kind of architectural playgrounds of retail and high-end offices, which on the one hand provided a quick fix. But on the other hand, if we think about what I see as significant for the creativity agenda, this fundamentally undercuts, this absolutely, through the success of this creative agenda, radically undermined the thing that was started, because the creative people couldn't afford to be there anymore. They had become appropriated, some would say exploited. And then with the crash, where we see that they can't fill the retail, they can't attract the anchor hotels, they can't get the businesses, the office space let, we see that both strategies have failed. The artists can't afford to be there, and the capital hasn't moved into those districts other than building the infrastructure. So who wins? Arguably, no one. But we're still making these errors, I think. A lot of places are still seeing the creative industries as just about growth, just about speed, and not even talking about attracting the small producers, the artists, the tiny creatives anymore. There's a new phase going on now, which I think will also fail, which is about big creative businesses. So rather than even bothering to nurture and attract and to grow the small stuff, we're seeing cities just trying to get the big stuff in. So this is Media City in Manchester, for example, which has got an anchor tenant in the BBC, but is trying to get Googles of this world and all the large media companies in. This is in a small town in the northeast of England called Redcar. They are trying to attract some anchor tenants from quite large media companies, but honestly, they're very unlikely to go there because they haven't provided the surrounding environment that enables talent to flourish. They haven't got the finer grain, the smaller things that are important. The networks aren't in place. There aren't hardly any artists working in that town because they haven't been able to support that environment to this date. The specialist business support isn't there. So I don't think they're going to fill this unless they have that deeper, more rooted and more connected strategic approach. We need to ensure that if we're going to support and grow our creative sector, that we do embrace the organic, the people-centered approach, that we do connect with the things that motivate people to get involved in creative practice in the first place. There is no model as such. There is no obvious chain from having creative practice to big business. We also, I think, and this is really important, we need to ensure that our creative sector is driven by an ambition to be inclusive rather than exclusive. One of the major failings of the creative sector over the last 10, 15 years is how exclusive it has become, how exclusive it is. A lot of the language about the creative sector was about how we would attract talent, diverse talent, how it was a means of employment for marginal, harder to reach communities. But as soon as the jobs started getting lost, we realized that the people still in jobs were the same people, the male, the middle class. Now, when Richard Florida talks about the creative class, when we apply that to a European context, we need to understand how class-ridden our society still is. More in the UK than Portugal, but Portugal still has a class system. And the creative class actually just became something exclusively for the middle class in too many places. And we've got to make sure that as we go into the next phase of creative economy development, that we attend to those specific issues. So it's not just a breeding ground for the people with the access to the privileged networks, the access to the privileged knowledge, the people who can afford to be interns in a company without getting any salary because they're from a background where they've got money in their family, the people who already know people. That's what happened last time. We can't let that happen again. And I think that if you read books like Guide to the Modern Ruins of Great Britain, you start to see how the creative economy agenda, at its worst, was about the monetization, the appropriation of creative capital purely for the indulgence of a middle-class aesthetic, and also purely to absorb middle-class labour and skills rather than a wider demographic. This is not just about social justice and inclusion, it's also about talent development and innovation, because if you don't connect with your overall talent base, then you're missing out your overall opportunity base. And it's the combination of people from different walks of life that I think will provide the innovation and the new ideas that not only will be sustainable and meaningful and authentic, but also will actually drive growth over the longer term in a more inclusive way. So we need to make sure, as you develop your approach to the creative economy here, that you absolutely engage with your creative talent at its heart, that you get out there in the communities where people are practicing in often very informal environments and work with them to co-create an agenda. And we need to move in that environment from an approach that shifts to talent development rather than spatial planning. A lot of the creative economy agenda has been about spatial planning. Let's develop a creative district. Where's our creative quarter? Actually, we need to think about how we ensure that that creative talent across the city is engaged, not just those in the creative quarter. And of course, this is an issue that's all the more important now than it was before because of the overall rise in youth unemployment. And also because the creative industries is often dependent on a very casual, flexible labour force, where people are not paid what they should be paid until they've got to a certain level in the organisation or the business. And that's okay if you can afford it, and there's almost an acceptance that you have to put the hours in and work almost for free to succeed. But I don't think we should allow that anymore. Partly it is about labour market reform, but it's also about the culture of doing business in the creative industries. If we want all of our talent to find opportunities in the sector, then we need to find ways of ensuring that they're remunerated for engaging in the sector, because otherwise the talent that we really need will drop away again. We also need to develop a strong evidence base. It's amazing how many places start investing in things like specialist business support for the creative industries, things like creative place-based tourism strategies, but they haven't actually done the research. And of course then, the wheels fall off. Now I think this event's great because it starts to build that process, which is asking and trying to find answers to these kinds of questions. If we're going to ensure that there isn't a homogeneous approach to creative city making, then we need to ask this question again and again and again and again, and to lots of different people in lots of different ways. But we also need them to be asking us those questions as well. We need to ask this question again and again. The whole language, as I said earlier, about the creative industries was that it creates this many jobs, it's growing this fast. That's fine, maybe, if you look at it in a macro level. Maybe that's fine if you look at it in big global cities, but it's not fine in small cities. Growth is only one way of understanding value. As a kind of interlude, as a sort of metaphor, I like this interpretation of growth from this Austrian artist, actually. So there's a cultural connection. I don't know if the visitors from Austria know Kurt. But I just love that this is just a guy who took a photo of an apple tree over many, many years and just monitoring, representing its growth. And you can kind of really see the quality, the value, that you can really feel the symbolism of that in terms of how you grow an economy. That hasn't just shot up overnight. And the way it goes through the seasons, maybe it has a bad year, maybe it struggles, but that's not the need to panic. The wonder is the way the apple tree overall has grown. So it's perhaps a nice way of understanding the role of the creative economy in smaller cities. And to get there, we need to really drill down to understand the unique combination of factors that create distinctiveness in a place, the DNA of a city. Get to understand that. And the organic way that cities grow and develop. The messiness, I think, is something to be celebrated and engaged and embraced. If you look in certain ways at cities, they are organic. Despite the best efforts of planners to structure, to change the way that cities flow, to enforce architecture onto cities, ultimately, because of the people, because of the flows of identities and histories and the way that people engage with a place, they are actually all, even the most modern cities, are actually quite organic. And I think the creative sector is also organic. It's messy. And it's about the messiness that creates the value. And we should think about what that means, ultimately. So the design solutions for our cities, for our creative economies, are different to what they were. There's no structured template. And we need to understand the creative city agenda on very specific terms. This is my city. This is why this city is creative. And we need to do that by reimagining the possibility of the city. And to do that, of course, it's all about talent. It's not about buildings. It's not about brands. It's about people living their lives. Now, we can do things to help that talent to prosper, to develop the kind of literacies or fluencies important, not just in terms of them being able to one day develop practice in the creative sector, but to be more creative across their lives, to apply their creativity. And of course, the starting point for that has to be, notwithstanding the role of parents, the role of education. In this city and other cities, can we create a journey for our young people where creative learning, arts-based learning, is something that is part of the mainstream rather than the margins of their education? Can we enable people to collaborate, to work in interdisciplinary teams? Can we, at an early stage, nurture the possibility that you can work in a creative practice, that it isn't about, it isn't a less worthy job than working in a more traditional sector or in medicine or in law, etc.? Can we nurture the possibility of creative work for our young people? We worked on a pilot project last year called Future City Jobs in six cities across Europe, which was about nurturing the possibility of creative work for young underemployed or unemployed people in those cities. And it was incredible how few people recognized that the creative sector was even an option for them. And maybe that's partly an outcome of the way the sector's been too exclusive, but I think it's also partly the way the education sector works, the way it funnels people into certain career paths, into jobs that perhaps don't even exist anymore. Now, if we embed creative learning in our young people from the very beginning of their educations, they're more likely to have the agility and the openness to be able to exploit employment opportunities in different sectors, not just in the creative sector. They're more likely to have the confidence, whether it's around communication skills, or about how they share ideas, or about how they move disciplines, to be able to ultimately develop the capacity to survive in an environment where, as we all know, we don't know what the jobs of tomorrow are going to be. At least creativity and creative learning can enable people to be more adept at exploiting those opportunities when they come their way. And there are other examples, like in the Arcola Theatre, near where my office is based, we've got a really strong youth-based employment program, trying to develop confidence through the performing arts for young people, not for them all to work in the performing arts, but to be more effective communicators, more confident individuals, so they can prosper in a wider employment market. And then there are specialist business support programs, like the Cultural Industries Development Agency, which I used to work at more than 10 years ago, but others that are about supporting young people as they move out of school, into university, or into the labour market, to give them the kind of nurturing and supporting environment to make the right decisions about where they go with their jobs, to give them, to help to reduce some of the fears they have about setting up their own businesses, and to give them a reason to work here, to stay here. I think this is really important when it comes to nurturing a creative employment program for a city. Too often there's a mismatch, there's a disconnect between the education sector and the business support environment from which they come, into which they enter after their education. And there aren't enough reasons often, there isn't enough love for the people to actually stay in this city. There isn't enough love for them to want to come back to the city. And of course, we need to just be mindful that it's not just young people we're talking about here. We're talking about all generations. And there are all sorts of fascinating innovations happening around things like university of the third age, but also in terms of the way that older people are often in the startup phase of their creative jobs as well, their creative careers. And we need to ensure that this isn't just seen as a youthful agenda, it's seen as a citizen's agenda around creativity. And in that context, not only do we need to critically give a critical perspective on the role of organisations like municipalities, we also need to think about the role of institutions within our cities. The role, for example, of our university sector, the historic role, the ivory tower, the place of privileged knowledge, those fortresses that people will kind of feel nervous about going into if they weren't already part of it. Now, we've seen lots of interesting models in recent years of universities having to find ways to be more open, to be more civic, to be more connected, to be more entrepreneurial. But we're still, I think, in the early stages of this. A university needs to be a centre, a hub for knowledge co-creation with the overall city, with the talent around the university, not just within it. So we need to open up knowledge creation. We need to open up the business models of our universities. There are some interesting examples. The University of the Arts in London has a programme in a district called Peckham Space. And this is all about developing creative projects with communities in their area, not in the university. It's socially engaged practice. It's a more civic approach to knowledge creation. The Festival of the Mind in Sheffield. This is the University of Sheffield, which is always seen as a very traditional university, very exclusive. The city itself felt it was disconnected from the university. But they've started to go out of the university now to develop projects with the communities. The Festival of the Mind doesn't ever happen inside the university. It's all in the city, and it's all about how do we create knowledge and share our knowledge as a society, as a city. So can our universities be more open, more connected in the way that they nurture a civic culture for our cities? And related to that, can we across our cities be much smarter in the way our institutions collaborate with one another? I think historically, too many institutions worked within their own in their own comfort zones. It's the way they were funded, it's the way that they were structured, it's the way that seemed to make sense historically. But a city, if it's going to nurture its full creative potential, needs to find those spaces in between the institutions, the messy spaces between the university and the school and the culture house and the business support programme and the different communities. And this quote, I use it too many times, but what we need is something different where the spaces and interactions can take place. So in Viana, where are those spaces where different disciplines come together to share ideas, exchange thinking, develop a new agenda? How convergent is this city? Or is it where the traditional interests are all still too atomized from one another? And I think this is important in terms of the overall creative economy as well, where we used to have this thing where the arts was over here, the commercial creative industries was over there. I think we need to find a much more kind of interactive landscape for the people that are making the money out of the creativity to come together with the people who've got the ideas, the talent, the finer grained stuff. And that's how you develop not just an economy for culture and creativity, but an ecology for culture and creativity. And that's how you innovate. Whether it's in the MIT model where you go for speed and you develop radical innovation, or can you actually, in a nurturing environment where you slow down, where you consider, where you put your different institutions together and with the talent of the people, can you actually develop a different kind of radical innovation, new agendas that are perhaps they're pondered on more slowly, perhaps they're softer and subtler in the way that they emerge, but ultimately they're just as radical as what happens in the speeded up kind of MIT model. Now, too often, I suppose, in the olden days around the creative industries, business meant an uncompromising perspective on the creative industries where it was seen as needing to be just like any other sector. It was having to develop the same kind of de-risking mechanisms. It had to position itself as operationally as quick and connected and as entrepreneurial in its focus as other sectors. I think that we're moving a little bit away from that. I think we need to think as much about social enterprise and different kinds of entrepreneurialism, more community-orientated entrepreneurialism, as well as the more fast-paced approach to business development. So when we talk later on in the next session about how we develop markets for our creative talent, when we talk about growth in the creative industries, can we talk about it in terms where growth might happen over a lifetime, where a sustainable community is made up of lots of individuals who are able to develop sustainable careers, but collectively that's a cluster? And ultimately, can we in this city develop opportunities for people to self-actualize in their creative ambitions? Now, self-actualizing in Viana might be different to self-actualizing in New York or London. We will need to develop different kind of environmental offer here. But it doesn't all need to be about the kind of traditional, macho, fast-paced business environment that I think has been dominant when it comes to the creative sector. So, if you're a creative business here, how do you feel that you can combine your lifestyle aspirations, living in this pleasant, historical, warm, cultural city, with access to knowledge about how to grow your business, access to information around emergent good practice, access to information about markets, access to skills, not just skills at the beginning of your career, but the continual professional development that's so important for creative people and to develop sustainable businesses. Where are your notice boards? Are there publications that provide you with the information that you need so that you feel if you're here growing your business, you're not compromising on the access to information that you might have if you were a business in Porto or in Lisbon or in London? Are there opportunities here to develop those physical but also digital hubs for creative people to come together so that they feel connected, so that they feel they can informally, rather than in the kind of starchy business way, connect with one another? Are there those kind of organic, distinctive locations for creative people in this city? This is a place called Village Underground near my office in London, which is where they use old trains on top of an old track. And it's a kind of community arts centre, but it's also a place with hot desking facilities. It's also a kind of social, cultural centre. It's also a venue. It's somewhere where the cultural way of life is combined with the business way of life. And it's a very, for one way or another, it's a very creative environment. How do you connect to and nurture a wider creative ecosystem? This is a place called the Criatividade in Hengelo, a small city in the east of the Netherlands. Their challenge is how they ensure that this creative factory they're refurbishing for young and old creative businesses is somewhere that doesn't feel isolated from the life of the overall city. So there's a challenge there because they want to create some kind of level of density so that you meet people who are in similar or complementary activities, but they also don't want to disconnect it from the life of the city. Because a creative city tomorrow can't be somewhere where the creative sector is seen as over there in that building, in that district. And I think that's a real challenge in a smaller city where you don't have those flows and you haven't got the same amount of people populating the bars, the cafes, the squares of the city who are working in the creative sector. So these are the kind of things that you might need to consider in this environment. You need to think about how you nurture the interrelationships between your businesses, between your creative individuals, so that when and if you have physical centres for the creative sector, they are absolutely embedded and connected with the wider city, the wider environment. You need to find a way of mixing people who are making things, but also environments where people are buying things as well, production and consumption, so that people from the city go to these creative spaces, not just see it as somewhere where creative production is happening elsewhere, happening outside of their reach. Of course, you need to look to the long term, but critically, and I think this is almost a fundamental point when it comes to the whole Creative Viana agenda, is that how do you embrace the cultural memory of this place? How do you ensure that it's seen that any creative industries agenda is seen as a continuation of that cultural memory, that distinctive landscape? This is a project in San Sebastian we worked on last year, where the agenda was around developing jobs in the creative industries for young people. But those young people, after working with them for a while, it became clear that actually what they wanted to do was set up a bakery, an artisan bakery. But they wanted to do it in a way that was seen as eminently creative. So they had all sorts of ideas about setting up these old units, using these old industrial container units from the shipping industry, but positioning them in a part of the city which was run down, which was disconnected, and almost seeing it as a kind of piece of acupuncture for the city, where they would have their creative artisan bakery, but it was almost like an artistic statement about the industrial heritage of the city, about this part of the city which needed renewal, and about their ambition as creative people to make a difference in that city. Okay, so we need to be holistic, and we need to engage our talent. I think a way to do that is to engage with infrastructure like arts and cultural centres, perhaps this kind of place. Arts and cultural centres used to be just about the production and then the display of their arts and cultural content. I think increasingly, because they are places where people come together, audiences come together, but also they also have things like education programs, outreach programs, our arts centres can become key players in driving a longer-term approach to creative city making. So this is Watershed in Bristol, which is an art house cinema, a cultural space, but what they're interested in most is about how they broker collisions, relationships between the talent of the city. They recognise that's vital to develop long-term audiences, but they also see that they have a civic role in providing an exciting, creative environment for people in the city to flourish in. And there are other examples like in Aarhus, in Denmark, in Northampton in the UK, where our art centres, our cinemas, our theatres, our galleries are increasingly convergent, cross-platform, cross-sector, cross-boundary, interdisciplinary. They're brokers, routers, connectors of the creative flows that happen in a city. They're the amplifiers of a lot of the things that happen in the city. So we need to think about the role of the arts sector in this city. We need to reappraise the role that the arts centres, our cultural infrastructure has for the creative economy of our cities. We need to reform and think about the kind of skills that you need to do that. Often we need new business models for our arts centres to do that. And we need new ways of exploring the value that they create. And this is a really key thing. We're seeing in this country and elsewhere the cutting of arts budgets, cutting of cultural budgets, which means, hugely disappointingly, that the ability for our arts and cultural sector to play a dynamic role in economic development, as well as in social and cultural development, is being completely diminished. I think the arts and cultural sector can drive innovation, drive sustainable development around the creative sector. They're not just old, unimportant, marginal elements of our social and cultural landscape. We need to rethink that, and quickly. Nearly there, you'll be relieved to know. This is perhaps where the language comes together a bit. The creative economy is dependent on developing a really strong social capital in the city. It's about the networks of networks coming together. It's about the different community interests, the different institutional interests coming together. This is something we did in a small place in West London last year, a small cultural centre, and we just mapped who goes there, where they come from, what they bring. And we realised actually there's lots of things come in, but they don't connect, they don't overlap, they don't meet each other. So you have yoga classes next to visual arts activities, music events, people coming in just for a coffee. If you could find ways for those people to interact, to connect, then you're starting to develop what I think is a real creative hub. And if you can find ways of doing that across your city, the city, by extension, becomes a creative hub. So it's not about speed. It's about quality. It's about distinctiveness. It's about slowing down for sustainability. Hassan Shalain, the fashion designer, came up with one of my favourite quotes here. The speed in our lives, it's about the speed in our lives and how it can only result in a crash. Now we see, I think, places recognising that the old language and the old way of doing things didn't work when it came to the creative sector. Places like Iceland, which struggled, actually, their creative sector went down in the time of boom because people were just working in finance. The talent wasn't even accessing, it wasn't even getting involved in the creative sector. I guess, if Björk had been born 20 years later, she might have ended up working in a bank rather than following a music career, because it was almost, it's full employment in the financial services in Iceland. Now that's not the case anymore. Maybe their creative sector will flourish, but maybe they'll find a way of developing added value from that now. So it's not about growth. It's about the value and the value added that the sector can provide. This is the roof of our building, the roof of our office, which is a kind of managed workspace, lots of artists, lots of creative people in there. But it's also a community. It's also a place where people are growing their own food. It's a place where people are selling their old clothes. It's more than just a business concern. And of course, you know that already. It's not about now. It's also about sustainability. And also, I don't think it's about size. It's about quality. And I think even the big cities are getting this now. A lot of the most innovative things when it comes to slowness and distinctiveness and community and collaboration are actually now happening in bigger cities as a response to the kind of speed and the depthlessness and the way that communities are atomized. So people are getting together out of kind of cultural necessity in bigger cities now. So we shouldn't just assume it's a smaller city agenda, but it is today, of course. So I guess I'll finish now. I was going to give you a rundown of my favourite approaches to slow creative economy making, but I think I've run out of time. I'm getting nods from the floor. Maybe I'll save that for the next session. But what I want to do, just to close really, is to suggest that when you do take a really serious look at how to develop your creative economy in Viana, that you, for a while, don't even look at the creative economy strategies of any other city, anywhere else. Just kind of almost have a kind of purdah on all of that. And for a while, just go out there and develop, perhaps through open space methodologies, when you bring people together in a very collaborative way, just explore with them what it is that's distinctively creative about Viana, and explore with them what they see as the role of the creative sector, whether it's about the arts or media or film or fashion, whatever it is, in their economy. And use that as the starting point. And then start to look at the good practice and the stuff that's not going on elsewhere. Because I think that it's places like this where you have this kind of vision and this ambition to, on the one hand, slow down, and on the other hand, to be creative, where you can actually develop a totally new paradigm on your own terms. And you can do it in a way which doesn't depend on approaches that have been undertaken anywhere else. So I wish you luck with all of that, and I look forward to exploring with you more today and hopefully beyond what it is that is possible here in terms of your creative potential. So on that note, thank you very much.